Okay, well, I will go ahead and say a welcome and thank you for joining us. And we have our author who was our One Book, One Community author back when we read Ugly Prey and did our 20s themed community book read. Emilie Le Beau Lucchesi, who is from Oak Park, the Oak Park area, and she is teaching at Elmhurst College, which she tells us just became Elmhurst University. So we want to welcome her back again, and she's going to talk about her book, This Is Really War, based on a true story of nurses during World War II. And I will turn it over to her. All right, thanks, Emilie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me back. I greatly appreciate the support that Stickney Public Library has shown me with both my books. Wave of hands, are we all good with the volume? Everyone can hear me? Okay, very good, very good. And part of the reason I appreciate the support so much is because, like my first book, I found Dorothy's story through my public library. And I was at Oak Park Public Library, and I was walking the shelves just looking for titles, which I'm sure is something you all like to do as well. And at the top shelf, I found a memoir written by a Navy Nurse POW, and it was out of print, and it had a lot of problems. Names were changed, and it used a lot of dialogue, which we can't in historical writing. And so I decided that I was going to take on this project. I was going to research it. I was going to use the correct names, and I was going to tell these women's stories. So first, I'd like to introduce the main subject of my book, and this is Nurse Dorothy Still. And Dorothy was born in about 1913, 1914. And she was from Long Beach, California. And she graduated high school in the heart of the Depression. And she wanted to go to Hollywood and become a costume designer. And her mother was horrified because it was the Depression. It was the early 1930s. People were losing their jobs, their homes. And she thought nursing would be a very practical course of study. And it was a great option to pursue in the moment because Dorothy received free tuition, free room and board, and a monthly stipend as a nursing student, which was tremendous. But once she graduated, she found out that nursing work was precarious. And so she wanted, she did something like, I think like 3 jobs in 2 years. At the time, most nurses were employed in private residences. And when they were on contracts with hospitals, it was really only a year long. So she saw that the US Navy was seeking nurses for the Federal Nursing Corps. And she applied. She thought this would be a great opportunity because she would get, once again, free room and board. She would have about 5 weeks of vacation, 4 to 5 weeks, and then she would have the opportunity in the future to train for an advanced degree in dietetics or physical therapy. So she applied to the Navy, really not thinking she would get in. And she was told to report by the end of 1937 to the Naval Hospital in San Diego. And as she reported to duty, the world was darkening, as you all know. The war in Europe was beginning to pick up, and Hitler was realizing that he could deport Jewish citizens and get away with it. In the South, in the East, Japan invaded mainland China, and in the rape of Nanking, more than 250,000 men, women, and children were killed in a 6-week time period. Dorothy was still pretty insulated from this. She was in San Diego for her first 2 years, And then she received notice that she was being transferred to the Philippines at the end of 1939. And she was a little bit nervous, but she was assured by the other nurses that this was a great assignment because it was so hot. Nurses only had to work a half shift, and she would have time for tennis and golf and dates with officers. And she was told to pack plenty of party dresses. So she did. And you'll see how unhelpful that is in a concentration camp. Let me take a moment to introduce you to the other nurses who became the 12 anchors and who were with Dorothy Still. At the top here, we have Chief Nurse Cobb, and she was from Kansas. And she was almost 50 years old when she was taken prisoner. And she was known as very firm, very, she had this kind of quiet confidence about her. So people would follow her lead. She never needed to yell or scream. But she was always hard on Dorothy as a younger nurse, was always making mistakes. So one thing you always notice is that in the pictures, the few that exist, wherever Cobb is, Dorothy's on the other side of the room. And I appreciated that. I liked that about Dorothy because at the time I began writing this book, I was finishing my dissertation, and I felt quite the same about my dissertation advisor. In the middle here at the top, we have Basilia Torres Stewart. And she was actually a Filipina native. And she joined the ranks of the Navy nurses in early 1942, just as they were taken prisoner of war. Her husband was a naval officer, and she was a charge nurse in a Manila hospital. And I find her to be tremendous because in the early days of captivity, these concentration camps were quite fluid. And as a Filipina native, as a citizen, she didn't have to stay in this concentration camp. It was only for prisoners who were Allied citizens. And she committed to these women, and she stayed with them. And she was very resourceful and helpful to them. And I find that remarkable because as much as we'd all like to say we'd do the same, I have to admit I would have been like, well, ladies, it's been real. I'll see you. But she stayed with them. And of course, we have Dorothy Still. She was 27 at the time of her captivity. Nurse Peg Nash here, and she was from Pennsylvania. She was the spirited woman. And the title of the book actually comes from her because she had all these great phrases. Much of the book chapters come from her as well. Helen Gorzlansky of Nebraska, Bertha Evans of Oregon, who was also the dietitian. Mary Frances Chapman here was our Chicago nurse. She was from the North Side. And when she came home, her parents met her on the tarmac of what is now Midway Airport. And the Chicago Daily Tribune would run little updates about her and what they knew. Mary Rose Harrington, originally from South Dakota. Eldine Page, also from South Dakota. Goldia O'Haver, and both Iowa and Minnesota get to claim her. Susie Pitcher of Iowa, and then Carrie Edwina Todd of California. So here are some pictures of Dorothy with the nurses in 1940 and 1941. And it was as promised initially. Here we have Dorothy with her tennis racket. And then here are the nurses in some downtime. Dorothy's here on the far right receiving a hug from Helen. Here's Nurse Goldia. This is Peg in conversation with Eldine. And so it was as promised, but as 1941 progressed, signs of war became more imminent. And the US military sent home dependents, and the US Navy began increasing their drills. At that point in time, though, the Philippines was sought to be the safest place in Asia because of the US military base. And this matters because there were Allied citizens who had business throughout Asia, and they were leaving places like Hong Kong and coming to the Philippines thinking they would be safe there. But as you know, in December of 1941, the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor, and then 3 days later, they set their sights on the Philippines. And I'd like to now show you a picture of the naval base burning. The naval base was outside of Manila, and it was on this peninsula that Dorothy described as being shaped like a crab's claw. And I see it now that she brings it up. And so you can see that one side was where they had the naval yard for ship repairs. They had the hospital, dormitories, administrative buildings. They also had an ammunition depot, which was very problematic when you're awaiting an attack. The nurses knew that if that ammunition depot took a direct hit, that the concussion would obliterate them all. So when Japan came for the Philippines, it was at noon, and the nurses had been on a lunch break. They had spent the previous few days liquidating the hospital and preparing for casualties, but they were not prepared for what happened next. And what happened next, the nurses heard for more than an hour, and they smelled. When the sirens went off, they went underneath their dormitory, which was surrounded by sandbags, and they heard the bombing for the next hour. And many of them, as you can imagine, did suffer hearing loss and ear damage for the rest of their lives as a result of this situation. What they didn't realize in the moment is that their defenses were completely failing. The US military did not have ammunition that could go as far high as the Japanese bombers were flying. And so they were really sitting ducks. And this went on for more than an hour. The nurses could smell the yard burning. They could hear the destruction. And when the all clear sounded, they ran across the naval yard or across out from their dormitory and towards the hospital. And they immediately began caring for wounded soldiers and sailors. The title of the book comes from this moment because Nurse Peg and Nurse Dorothy were assigned to a ward together. And when they went into this ward, they saw that victims of the bombing had already been brought in. They were dumped in the beds. They saw that there were men who were badly burned. They saw men who were missing limbs from the blasts. There was all sorts of dislocations so that hips were jutting out to the side or knees were coming at a right angle in the wrong direction. And Peg looked at Dorothy and she said, "Oh my God, this is really war." Now, they weren't prepared. They never received any training in San Diego on how to be war nurses, but they were extremely capable women. And so what they began doing is triaging people when they came in, administering morphine, and getting them up to surgery. Problematically, they were doing this without power because Basilia's husband actually was very helpful in shutting down the power supply because of the fire and thus avoided a catastrophic explosion. This went on until midnight, and at that point they evacuated the hospital because the admiral had received word from the Japanese military that they would bomb the hospital within 36 hours. The Japanese military signed but never ratified the Geneva Convention, so they weren't playing by any rules of engagement. Once Dorothy and the other nurses were evacuated, they were combined with the Army nurses, and they were sent to makeshift hospitals around the city. And Dorothy was sent to a racquetball club, which was very, I think, odd for her. It was quite surreal. And at this racquetball club, the citizens of Manila didn't quite realize that they could bring their wounded for surgery and for medical care. So it was quite empty and it was eerie. And one day she received permission to go to the Manila Hotel, and she asked for permission to do so because she wanted to send a telegram to her parents and to tell them she was okay. And in what I think is such a moment that is reflective of her personality, Dorothy sent them a telegram that said, "Christmas greetings, don't worry about me, everything under control." Because she didn't want her parents to worry, but of course they should have been frantic. As Dorothy was leaving the Manila Hotel, it was already dark because she had waited for so long in line to send this telegram. And she was a little nervous about walking back in the dark. And she saw a military sedan. And she went and she asked the driver for a ride back to where she was posted. And he said that he was under orders and he could not do so. And then all of a sudden, a man stepped from the back. And he asked her what the problem was, and she explained. And he leaned down and he told the driver to take Dorothy wherever she wanted to go. And she was so grateful she got in the sedan. She was thanking the driver and who was that man, and will you thank him for me? And he said, that was General Douglas MacArthur. And one of my favorite parts of the book is if you go back and you look in the index, when MacArthur shows up, he shows up in relation to his interaction with Dorothy. And that's how he first shows up. And I think that's neat because it's really not often in women's history that we position these leaders in relation to women. So I was quite happy that how that turned out. I had nothing to do with that. But if you look in the back, you'll see what I'm talking about. Well, let's talk about MacArthur for a moment. He was dealing with quite a bit because in Washington, D.C., President Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill and the Minister of Defense, and Roosevelt realized that they were not prepared for war. The U.S. had maintained a peacekeeping army. We did not have the people we needed, the heavy equipment. We weren't ready for war. And so Churchill was pushing for a Germany first approach. And he envisioned that the Allies would come at Germany from every side and effectively create a circle around Germany and suffocate them. But that meant the same thing was going to happen in the Philippines. They were sending no supplies, no additional soldiers, sailors, or Marines, no more medical personnel. And so if MacArthur went with War Plan Orange, he was going to be going at it alone. War Plan Orange came up during peacetime, and the plan was to evacuate Manila and leave it as an open city and go to the peninsula of Bataan and the island of Corregidor to wage the defense of the Philippines. Problematically, they did not have the manpower or supplies needed to be successful with the defense. The Admiral of the Navy disagreed with War Plan Orange, and he took his remaining fleet to the Dutch East Indies. When the Admiral left, he left behind 12 Navy nurses, several hundred patients, surgeons, pharmacists, corpsmen, and left them to be taken prisoner of war. So the end of 1941-42 was a very difficult time for Dorothy and the other nurses because they saw the Army evacuating their own patients. They saw the Navy leaving. They saw the Army preparing for battle, and they realized they were being left behind. But under Chief Nurse Cobb's direction, the nurses remained on duty and they continued to nurse. They were taken prisoner of war January 2nd, 1942. Here they are. In March of 1942, when they were transferred to a civilian concentration camp at Los Baños. I'm sorry, not Los Baños, at the University of Santo Tomas. And this picture was taken by the Japanese military for propaganda purposes. Now, Dorothy is over here on the far right. She is out of uniform because she had had hepatitis, which is really indicative of what they had been dealing with in terms of lack of sanitation, dwindling food while they were prisoners in the hospital with their patients. I should note the men they served with were sent to a military prison camp, which was effectively a death camp. So here you see Chief Nurse Cobb. Notice she's standing a little bit in front of her nurses. That would be the way it would be in the coming years. Always a smidge ahead, always trying to procure whatever she could for them, and also trying to hide bad news from them. Nurse Peg here, for example, where my cursor is, she had been slated for execution after 2 inmates escaped because she had been the nurse on duty. And Cobb kept that a secret and just kind of absorbed that pain. One thing to note about Cobb is that whenever they transferred, she would she would put underneath her buttons there all of the nurses' documents, all of their records. And this was not allowed because record keeping was forbidden among prisoners. But she would do so, and then she would don a flower away to kind of hide that incriminating square. And because she did that, we have more documentation on what the nurses did, how they served, and this entitled them one day to pay and promotions. So that was very important. There's kind of a funny moment in the book where Dorothy sees when they're being transferred to a concentration camp, and she sees Chief Nurse Cobb wearing the lei, and she's irritated. She's like, why is she dressed like we're going to a party? And she doesn't realize in the moment that Chief Nurse Cobb is trying to do something for them. So let me tell you a little bit about the Santo Tomas civilian concentration camp. This was at the University of Santo Tomas. The nurses were held in 3 prisons. All of them were at universities. And that might strike you as odd, but if you think about it, and I hope my students don't hear me saying this, but universities are actually ideal prisons in this situation. I hope my students wouldn't enjoy that comment too much, right? And so if you think about why, well, you have classrooms in which to confine the inmates. You have a food system should you choose to feed them, which the military did not, their captors did not feed them often. And then you had bathrooms, but also most importantly, a overhead speaker system, which was used to wake up inmates with music to really kind of control the population. And so that's what this is about, is control. And the universities are already built, and so they were taken over by the Japanese military for this purpose. So what would a typical day be like for you if you were an inmate at Santo Tomas? Well, in the beginning, there was about 2,400 inmates. It would eventually swell well above 3,000. And in the beginning, there was more of a fluidity to the camp. Inmates were allowed to leave for medical purposes, or if they had some sort of pass permitting them to leave. That stopped very quickly. And as the war progressed, the better the Allies did, the more hostile the living environment became for the inmates. So if you were at Santo Tomas, you would sleep most likely if you were a man. In this picture here on the right, and this is the men's gymnasium, you were allotted 22 square feet of living space. So that's really enough for a bedroll and whatever supplies you were keeping for yourself, and then a mosquito net if you had one. You would wake up in the morning when the guards played music, and then if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you would wait in line. There was an average of 106 inmates per one toilet. After that, and by the way, I should mention, when you got to the front of the line, although the bathrooms were segregated by sex, there were no partitions, so you did have to relieve yourself in full view of others, which was humiliating. If you wanted to shower, it was the same thing, crowding around a nozzle while hundreds of people waited and watched for you to complete your turn. At that point, you would probably want to collect your one of two meals. And it was typically rice. In the beginning, there was a duck egg or a bit of fish or vegetables if you were lucky. And that was depleted as the war progressed. Now, the Japanese military did not feel obligated to supply their inmates with food. And so initially the red meals. And so you have here depended on, can everyone hear me okay? I got a little warning that my internet connection was unstable. So inmates depended on friends or family who lived in Manila, who were not citizens of Allied countries, who weren't inmates, who could bring them food, supplies. And so here on the left, you have inmates who had more means built what they call these shanties, and you weren't permitted to sleep there, but you were permitted to go and to, in the middle of the day, and just get away from the masses of humanity and just be separate. And so these were considered a great luxury. You could also cook in them if you had the means. Now, on their first day, Chief Nurse Cobb had the nurses report to duty at the makeshift infirmary. And here is a picture of Nurse Peg, and she's caring for an inmate. So you can see this is very crude, very rudimentary. I think in the background, I think based on the hair, that might be Nurse Mary Frances. But what you can see, Peg is truly supplying is comfort and care. In the beginning, they did have some medicines, but they primarily had to send most serious cases to an outside hospital for care. And as you can imagine, that would stop as the war progressed. And so the nurses very early on were seeing people who were reporting having issues related to their declining nutrition and their declining health. So you can imagine for women that stopped menstruation, men found themselves impotent. You'd see things, bleeding gums, teeth becoming loose, and then incontinence. But also there was serious tropical diseases as well as tuberculosis. And the nurses were caring for these inmates. Now, initially they did so alone. And then by September of 1942, 66 Army nurses were captured, and they were sent to Santo Tomas. So at that point, the nursing shortage was solved. But in May 1943, the Navy nurses learned that they were needed elsewhere. And what happened was the camp commander decided he wanted to build a countryside prison camp. And he wanted to do so near Lake Laguna, which was the largest freshwater lake, and wanted to really get the camp away from the city. And so he was requiring 800 able-bodied men to transfer to the new camp, which would be at the University of Los Baños, an agriculture college. And he was requiring them to build barracks and toilet facilities. So as you can imagine, many inmates were not interested in transferring. There would be no running water, no electricity. They were greatly concerned that the water supply would not be substantial, but also it was dangerous. As you'll read in the book, Santo Tomas had many instances of violence, executions, but inmates were learning how to navigate that and how to live their life and survive in Santo Tomas. Los Baños was a risk. And so in May 1943, a civilian physician approached Chief Nurse Cobb, and he told her that he was transferring to the new prison camp, and would the Navy nurses be willing to go? Because the Army captain of the nurses refused to have her nurses go and was insisting they maintain as one unit. So if the 12 Navy nurses did not go, there would be no medical care providers outside of him. And so Chief Nurse Cobb gathered the nurses and she asked them one by one if they'd be willing to go. And she said it was a choice, but it had to be anonymous. And if anyone had reservations, they could say no. And so she went around and she asked each of these women, one by one, if they'd be willing to sacrifice themselves and take this risk. And one by one, she asked them. She asked Nurse Peg, she asked Nurse Helen, Mary Frances, Dorothy, and they all said yes, because they could not deny that they were needed. On the morning of the transfer, the nurses woke up early when the music played, and they went downstairs to await the flatbed trucks that would bring them to the railroad station. And the men who were departing left first, and a crowd had come to see off the inmates and to wish them well. And when the nurses began climbing onto the trucks, the crowd began to clap and cheer. And the nurses turned around and looked at the crowd. Nurse Mary Rose remembers crying because she didn't realize how much they mattered to people. And then they heard it over the PA system. Someone had a secret copy of the Navy March song, Anchors Away, and they played it for the nurses because they were truly the anchors of the camp. They stopped hopeless and ailing inmates from drifting. There were so many people in this camp who had no family. They'd sent them back to their home country, or maybe they had married a local and their spouse didn't have to be imprisoned. And they had no one and they were alone. But when they were in this bed, like this woman here, they had a Navy nurse and they had an anchor. And so the nurses were transferred on a flatbed truck, and they were transferred on a flatbed truck, and they were then actually put on boxcars, which was terrible because they lacked ventilation. But this was indicative of the treatment to come. Although 1943 was a fairly calm year, and it allowed the nurses to set up in an infirmary, of which they were really quite resourceful. They used things like tree sap to make bandage adhesive. Remember those party dresses I brought up? Those were turned into rags. They did so much to constantly be working and creating this infirmary. In the beginning, they had access to insulin for diabetics, vitamins, anesthesia for surgery. But as the war progressed, particularly in 1944, their captors became increasingly sadistic. You have to think about it. If you were the Japanese military and you had a very talented officer, would you keep him in guard of inmates you truly didn't care about? Or would you send him elsewhere where he was more useful to you? So they tended to get really kind of these backwards, mean camp commanders and guards. And they, in particular, the supply officer was unbelievably sadistic, and he intentionally halted supplies. So by the end of 1944, they were getting about 500 calories every other day. And this was the result. After the war, when General MacArthur saw these inmates, he was furious, and he said these were not internment camps. These were concentration camps. They were, for the military camps, they were death camps. For the civilian camps, they were slow motion death camps. So to put this into perspective, if you were an American soldier and you were taken prisoner of war by the Germans, you had a 1% death rate. If you were an American soldier and you were taken prisoner of war by the Japanese military, 48% death rate. If you were an American civilian and you were taken prisoner of war, it was actually an 11% death rate for civilians. And that was only because the Japanese military did not succeed in executing all the inmates as planned. What they did do was cut off supplies, cut off medicine, and watch people begin to waste away. In the hospital, Dorothy and the nurses continued to show up for shifts, despite the fact that they had their own maladies. None of the nurses weighed more than 100 pounds. I'm going to show you in a little bit a picture of Peg Nash. She weighed 68 pounds and had undiagnosed tuberculosis. Chief Nurse Cobb developed arthritis as well as a heart condition, but they all showed up for their shifts. And by the end, they could really only offer comfort and sit with patients as they died. Now, in the beginning of 1945, the US military was wanting to liberate these concentration camps because of what happened in December of 1944 at a concentration camp on the island of Palawan. This was a slave labor camp with about 150 survivors of the Bataan Death March. And they were being used as slave labor to create airplane tarmacs for their captors. And as the war progressed, Japan was either sending back prisoners to Japan or they were killing them. They did not want to have prisoners when they lost the Philippines, which they sensed they would. And so in this one tragic event, the prisoners were told to go into their bomb shelters, and then the guards set those shelters on fire. It's a very harrowing part of the book. And 6 men survived of the 150, and they made it to guerrilla headquarters and then onto US intelligence, and it became determined that they would liberate these prison camps. The US military, with their Filipino allies, first liberated Cabanatuan in January of 1945. This had about 500 men left from the Bataan Death March. And then they were able to get to Billy Bid Prison, which was where Basilia's husband was. It had been a civilian prison that was used to hold military men prisoner. And then they were able to get to Santo Tomas in February. But Dorothy and the other nurses were in Los Baños. And so they were in enemy territory. And so the US allies weren't able to get to them until February of 1945. And so what was really scary is that they planned the liberation for February 23rd at dawn. And on February 22nd, the guards began setting up machine guns and turning the barrels inward. They also began digging mass graves. Inmates who kept secret journals described themselves as being too lethargic to care because they were so starved. Dorothy was actually on the night shift when they were liberated at dawn. And when she heard the gunfire, she initially thought that the execution had begun, but they were being liberated. And the liberation was truly perfect. And so what they did, here we have a map of Los Baños over here. The U.S. Military and their Filipino counterparts had kind of a three-part approach to this liberation. So first, they had these amphibious vehicles that could go in water and land. And in the middle of the night, they were going to cross this lake, and they were going to then come on land and approach the camp. At the same time, Filipino forces would surround the camp on the ground, and the signal was to wait for the paratroopers. When they heard the roar of the planes, they were told to invade the camp. Now, they picked the most prime time to liberate the camp, and that is they learned from prisoners who escaped, who the nurses marked as dead so that there would not be retribution. These young men escaped, and they told U.S. intelligence something very important, and that was that every morning at dawn, their captors would lock up their weapons, strip down to their loincloths, and do calisthenics. So with the entire garrison unarmed, it was the prime time to attack, and they did. So Dorothy was on duty, and she ended up being one of the last ones liberated, or last ones to leave the camp. And here she is, actually on top of the Amtrak as it goes into the lake. She's here on the left, Nurse Aldine and Rachel on the right, and they are caring for an inmate who passed out in the hold. And they're just trying to provide some comfort and care to him. And you see an American soldier behind them is holding up the umbrella to try to shade him from the heat. And so if you look at these distinctions for how emaciated these inmates were, despite the fact that these nurses needed care, when they were brought to Billy Bid Prison, it was being used as a staging area for recently liberated prisoners, but as well as casualties of the Battle of Manila. So these nurses were set to work. And finally, after a week, Chief Nurse Cobb said, "Enough. My nurses need their own care." So they began sending them back to the US. And along the way, every island they stopped at, they had to do some sort of photo opportunity with the military. And here they are meeting with the Admiral. And Dorothy, I want to point out, is about 31 years old in this picture. And she passed out because she had beriberi And then she'd been on the night shift the night that they were liberated. And she continued to nurse during liberation. And she had to walk the 2 miles from the camp to the beach because there weren't enough Amtraks. And so she was in terrible condition. You can see she looks like she's panting. And then you can see right here, her best friend and roommate, Nurse Aldine, looks like she's trying to kind of position herself close to her friend, and she's very concerned. Other nurses here, we have our Chicago nurse, Mary Frances, is right here. This is Nurse Susie from Iowa, I'm sorry. She had a heart attack in the camp. Here's Nurse Goldia, Chief Nurse Cobb, Nurse Helen from Nebraska. Goldia is right here, and Nurse Peg is right here. Bertha, I think, is back here somewhere. And then there's a couple civilian nurses in pictures as well. As they came back, they were asked to pose for pictures and to really act like nothing happened, and that they were, if you will, witnesses to the trauma, but not participants in themselves. They were advised to not speak of their experience, and when they were, to kind of speak about themselves as caregivers as opposed to victims. But this is the picture I told you of. This is Nurse Peg. Look at her hips here. Do you see where my cursor is going? She is 68 pounds in this picture, and she's undiagnosed tuberculosis. Look at the line here on Nurse Bertha, right? So these chocolates, these hair care products, these were not going to fix these nurses, but that was the treatment they were being given, this idea of, you know, give them hair products, give them some magazines, American cigarettes, and they'll be fine. And that wasn't the case. And what happened was that Dorothy was put on the speaking scene. She had a few months, a few weeks in which she was able to recover. And then her and Nurse Aldine received orders to report to the naval base at Annapolis. And when they did, they actually bought an old car and they drove together. And I think that cross-country drive was very therapeutic. But Dorothy was a beautiful young woman. She had blonde curly hair, and it was like the military saw her as a fundraiser. They saw her as speaking about her experiences and raising war bond money. Because at that point in time, the U.S. was still fighting a war on 2 fronts. If any of you have any public speaking fears, you can only imagine what she was enduring at this point. And she became, she describes herself as depressed during this time period. She cried easy and without provocation. When she did begin crying, she found it difficult to stop. So she requested a transfer to Panama to get away from the speaking tour, to get away from it all. And as a prisoner of war, she received first pick, so she was able to go. But she was ready to leave the Navy after the war ended, and she was engaged at that point to the officer, and to an officer, and he told her, why not see if you can get a medical discharge? You're having all these emotions. You were a prisoner of war. Go see the naval psychiatrist and try to get a medical discharge. And so Dorothy did so. And she met with a psychiatrist, and he asked her story, and she took him back to the beginning, the bombing of Cavite, that hospital where all these horribly wounded casualties were brought in. She talked about being abandoned in Manila. Yeah, a little bit of feedback. I don't know. No, it's okay. Hopefully you guys don't hear that feedback as well. She talked about being abandoned in Manila. She talked about being taken to the Santo Tomas prison camp and then Los Baños, and then being liberated on the very day they thought they were going to be executed. And the psychiatrist asked her what date that was, and she told him February 23rd, 1945. Does that ring a bell with anyone? was Iwo Jima. And this psychiatrist, for some reason, he thought she was implying she was at Iwo Jima, but he just snapped. And he said to her, "You lie. You are a liar and a fake. And you're not a soldier, and you're not a sailor. You're not a man. You didn't suffer." And Dorothy left his office shaking, and she vowed she would not speak of her experiences. She married the officer, and they had a home in Southern California. She had 3 children, and her daughter found the picture of her nursing on top of the Amtrak. It had run in Life magazine, and Dorothy downplayed it. For the rest of her life, she treated it like she'd gone to sleepaway camp, and she roughed it. But in the 1990s, she wanted to write a memoir, and that psychiatrist was still in her head because he made her feel like she didn't have a right to her experiences. But when I found that book, I said to myself, that psychiatrist can't tell me what to do. And so I will tell this story. And Dorothy has been well honored by her family. And when she died in the summer of 2001, her family had her buried at Arlington. And after the funeral, the Navy Nurse Corps asked her family to come to a special ceremony. And what they had planned was the Old Glory passing of the flag. And this is the tradition that's typically reserved for flag officers when they retire. But the Navy Nurse Corps decided to bend the rules, and they gave her this honor. And as they went through the ceremony and they passed this folded flag from one nurse to the next, one woman to the next, I think what they were truly saying was that Dorothy Still, Navy Nurse POW, was being heard. And I believe they said to her in that ceremony, "Dorothy Still, I hear you. I hear you." And that is the story. It's at your local library. There's plenty of copies in the system, and you guys have a great sharing program. So it's at the local library. If you prefer an audiobook, it is so beautifully narrated. The narrator on it has won all sorts of awards. I was so excited. She even said my name right. It was great. There's also Kindle, Nook, iTunes, so however you want it. But I'd be happy to take your questions. I don't know if I need to unmute anybody or if we're all good, but it's a small group, so this is a great time for questions and comments, whatever you'd like to share.
And I'll just say thank you. And there is a little feedback, but I was still able to hear you. The feedback was pretty faint.
Oh, good. Okay.
At least for me, so I hope for everyone else that they are able to hear all right. Yeah, any questions for Emily? I'll just say I read the book, and yeah, it was like so infuriating that that psychiatrist was telling her that she didn't suffer. Like that's just so unbelievable.
And that came from her son, actually. So that was just really great that he wanted to share this story, and it was something he really wanted me to know because he felt like it shaped the course of her life. And even when she wrote her memoir, she initially wanted to write it as a novel and write it in the third person. And she published it with the Naval Institute Press. And the historian there really worked with her to make it more of a historical document. But she still changed names. She used a lot of dialogue. And it was like he was just still in her head. If only we knew his name.
Horrible.
Any questions? Or I think Margaret,
Somehow, Margaret, you got muted again. Can you unmute yourself?
Various ways. to see if I could help improve the sound. But anyway, just mentioned that one of our patrons who didn't get here, I think I emailed you this morning to say that I had found her. When she read the book, she came into the library, and very soft-spoken, lovely lady, and sat down and told me how she appreciated having the book and very much wanted to come. And then she wasn't enough to tell me that she opened the book and she had to read me from the book. And she chose what she wanted to read, and she became very, impassioned. And she chose to read the section where Dorothy goes to the psychiatrist.
Oh, yeah.
And tells her that she's a fake and that she's not, that betrayal in the first place of any psychiatrist saying anything of that nature to a patient. There's that, which is that whole thing at the time. So she was pretty incensed about that, but at the same time appreciated the revelations that were in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and the descriptions of what these young women endured.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to mention that since we featured it in the our gathering today. Also, there's so much in the book that's in the book that we wouldn't be able to cover in an hour. So
No.
Emily and Sonia, just a lot of their efforts to stay not just stay alive, but to stay emotionally and mentally alive as well.
I think they kept others.
Did you mention, I see Dorothy wrote a memoir?
Mm-hmm. She did. It's called, Oakport Public Library has it, so it's available through interlibrary loan, and it's called What a Way to Spend a War. And it's, it's funny, her grandson reached out to me and he said he remembers her writing it. And it's very, it was helpful to me in writing the book because she told me she hit the real key outline, the outline of it. She changed names, but she allowed me to have perspective on how she felt about things when they happened, although she tended to keep it more light. She gave an oral history to the Bureau of Medicine, their history division, and that it's something like 30,000 words. It's a very long oral history. It's about 80 pages typed. And there, the oral historian, he really pulled it out of her. So that was very helpful. And then there were several other oral histories that I was able to use in order to fully piece together what happened. But sometimes too, I had to use the hidden diaries and journals of inmates in that camp and then match it up, because there was just so much they did not want to discuss.
Oh, right. Oh, diaries must have been very interesting.
There was one woman who was a nurse, and she's in the book, and she's pretty prominent whenever I bring up Santo Tomas. And she was just really, her name was Tressa, and she was from the US, and she kind of had a good attitude. Like, one time she got a magazine that was 7 years old, and she said it was so old that it felt new again. And I actually really liked her. But I had another diary of, it was a memoir, not a diary, of the one woman, Margaret Shirk. You may remember her as the woman who had the child and then got the boyfriend in the camp, and she left her husband for him. Her memoir, she was very dislikable. She was a very angry person. She was clearly traumatized by what she went through, and she really had no empathy for anyone else. It was pretty fascinating.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you for all the support you've given my books. I really appreciate this so much.
Yeah, and Margaret actually listened to the audio. Margaret, I think you said?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, actually, Margaret, you're muted again. Trying to unmute you.
Am I with you now? Okay. I actually wanted to look at I like hard copies, but I really wanted to look at both the ebook and the audio. Yes, so I did do the audio, and it was a slower read. I guess that's always the case. But I did enjoy it that way too. It was another way to be engaged. I liked doing both. I have to say, would not have wanted really particularly to not have read the book. I just enjoyed reading the book. Enjoy maybe isn't in the word. And I just wanted to say earlier from when we spoke earlier, I don't know if my voice came through. I was surprised. Pardon me? I was surprised that some of the ladies, they lived to be in their 80s and 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah. No. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah. Bertha Evans, Aldine Page, they lived the longest. Dorothy was in her 80s. Chief Nurse Cobb was in her 80s. Mary Frances Chapman died young. Nurse Helen was killed by a drunk driver in the 1970s. I mean, could you imagine how useless are you as a human being? And only you kill someone drunk driving, but this is amazing POW. Like, shame on you. And then poor Nurse Susie died at the age of 50 from leukemia. She had very poor health. She had a heart attack. She had emphysema, and then she died in the camp. Yeah, and she had emphysema. She was 40 when she went into camp. And she died at the age of 50. So several of them did die young. Basilio lived a long life, but most of them actually did, same with Mary Rose, live long lives. Only 2 of them had children. That was Dorothy and Mary Rose. Most of them did marry. I think all but 2 married.
Two, I think, yeah.
I think it was Nurse Carrie or Edwina and Nurse Aldine. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much, everyone, for this support. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye. Yeah, happy 4th of July.
If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to the Stickney-Forest View Public Library's YouTube channel. Also, like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The Stickney-Forest View Public Library District, where great things happen.